Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Hey, Chris. Hey, everyone. We have an absolute whopper of a story today, and it lands at this strange intersection of AI policy, constitutional law, military procurement, and corporate values all colliding at once.
Yeah, yesterday, May 1st of 2026, the Pentagon, which, by the way, is now officially branded as the Department of War, announced a massive batch of artificial intelligence agreements for its classified networks.
7 companies got the green light to deploy their models on the most sensitive military systems we have. And the lineup reads like a who's who of the entire commercial AI landscape right now.
Walk us through who made the cut, because the names matter a lot here for understanding what the Pentagon is actually trying to build inside its classified perimeter and how it's hedging.
Sure. The 7 are Elon Musk's SpaceX, which now folds in XI and Grok after the acquisition, plus OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, Nvidia, Amazon Web Services, and a startup called Reflection AI. 6 of those names you'd guess in your sleep. But Reflection is the interesting one because it's a relatively young open-weight model shop. Not a hyperscaler, and that placement is deliberate.
Right, and a source familiar with the deal told the Agence France Presse that the open source side of this portfolio is being supplied specifically by Nvidia and by Reflection AI together. So the Department of War is consciously building a mix of closed frontier models and open weight models on its classified networks, which is a strategic posture I want to come back to.
It is a huge tell because for years the assumption was that classified military deployments would be locked to closed proprietary systems for security reasons. And now that assumption is being inverted publicly.
But the bigger headline, the one that everyone is leading with this morning, is who is not on that list. And that, of course, is Anthropic, the company behind Claude.
And not just absent, Chris. Anthropic is actively blacklisted, formally designated a supply chain risk by the Department of War, which legally bars any contractor or partner from doing commercial business with them.
For listeners who haven't been tracking this saga closely, can you set the table on how we got from Anthropic signing a $200 million Pentagon contract last July to outright blacklisting?
Absolutely. So in July of 2025, Anthropic signed that $200 million Pentagon prototype agreement, which at the time looked like a coming-of-age moment for the safety-oriented AI lab. But the moment the implementation discussions got specific, the two sides hit a wall over usage scope. And that wall is what produced everything we are talking about today, almost a year later.
The Department of War wanted what they call all lawful purposes access, meaning if it's legal under U.S. law, the military can use Claude for it, full stop, no carve-outs at all.
And Anthropic said, no, we will deploy with you, but we have 2 non-negotiable lines we will not cross. And those 2 lines are the heart of this entire fight.
What are those 2 lines exactly? Because I want our listeners to understand what Anthropic was actually objecting to, since the public narrative has gotten muddled in the political back and forth.
First, no fully autonomous weapons targeting decisions, meaning a human stays in the loop on lethal action. Second, no use of Claude for domestic mass surveillance of American citizens, period, end of sentence.
Those sound to me at least like pretty defensible bright lines, the kind of thing a responsible AI company would want in any defense contract, especially given current public anxieties about AI and warfare.
Most ethicists would agree with you, and frankly, so would a lot of national security professionals who privately think autonomous targeting is a bad idea, even from a purely military effectiveness standpoint.
But Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth did not see it that way at all. In early March of this year, he posted on X declaring Anthropic effectively unfit to do business with the department.
His exact framing was that effective immediately. No contractor, supplier, or partner doing business with the Pentagon may engage in any commercial activity with Anthropic, which is a sweeping ban with industry-wide ripple effects.
That's a nuclear option in procurement terms, because it doesn't just kill the Anthropic defense contract directly. It tells every single defense prime contractor that Claude is now radioactive across all their projects.
Right, and Anthropic responded by suing in 2 separate federal courts on March 9th of 2026. Alleging First Amendment retaliation and Administrative Procedure Act violations against the Department of War.
The First Amendment angle is fascinating to me because Anthropic is essentially arguing that they are being punished by the government for publicly stating their values and safety commitments around AI deployment.
And on March 26th, U.S. District Judge Rita Lynn agreed at least preliminarily, granting an injunction that called the supply chain risk designation pretextual, with the real motive being unlawful retaliation. Very strong words.
A pretextual designation is judicial speak for You made up a national security excuse to punish a company for speaking out, which is exactly the kind of thing the First Amendment is supposed to prevent.
But here's where it gets messy, because on April 8th, a federal appeals court in Washington, D.C. denied Anthropic's request to temporarily block the blacklisting while the underlying lawsuit continues to play out.
So the practical effect is that Anthropic won the early skirmish at the trial court level, but lost the next round. And as of yesterday's announcement, the blacklist is fully operative and biting.
Which is why, when the Department of War rolled out its big 7-company AI announcement on May 1st, Anthropic was nowhere near the room, and Pete Hegseth made sure everyone noticed that absence.
Now here's the part of the story that absolutely scrambles your brain if you try to hold it all in your head at once. Because there is a parallel track involving a model called Mythos.
Yes, Mythos, which we covered on this show back on April 20th, the 10 trillion parameter Anthropic model with these jaw-dropping cyber defense capabilities, tied to something called Project Glasswing, very advanced stuff.
And Pentagon Chief Technology Officer Emil Michael said something genuinely surprising on CNBC's Squawk Box yesterday morning that I think a lot of listeners may have missed in the headline noise.
He said that Anthropic is still a supply chain risk and the blacklist still stands, but he framed Mythos as, quote, a separate national security moment that has to be dealt with government-wide.
That is corporate, carefully lawyered language for, we are blacklisting the company. But we still desperately want this one specific model because it can find and patch cyber vulnerabilities better than anything we have.
And the reporting from CNBC and others suggests that the National Security Agency is already actively using a not yet publicly available version of Mythos, even while the Department of War is suing the parent company.
That is a very strange place for any AI company to be sitting, simultaneously banned from one part of the federal government and quietly embedded in another, while the legal fight continues on a third track.
It is also why Dario Amodei, Anthropic's chief executive, met with senior Trump administration officials at the White House last month. And Trump himself told CNBC afterward that a deal is, quote, possible.
So the politics are clearly more fluid than the public blacklist suggests. But the operative reality on May 2nd of 2026 is that Anthropic is locked out of the marquee classified networks deal entirely.
Let's talk about what this actually means for the AI ecosystem. Because the consequences here go well beyond one company's contract with one customer, no matter how big and prestigious that customer happens to be.
The first big implication in my reading is that this sets a precedent for what happens when an AI company tries to apply its own ethical guardrails to a major government deployment context.
Right, the message from the Department of War is essentially, if you want to play in the defense market, you accept all lawful uses without carve-outs, and your values are not part of the deal.
That puts every other AI lab in an awkward position because OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, and the rest just signed up under exactly those terms, with no public carve-outs around autonomous weapons or surveillance use cases.
And we should be honest, those companies have their own internal usage policies too, but none of them drew the kind of public bright line that Anthropic did. And that turned out to be the differentiator.
The second implication is the rise of Reflection AI as the open source American alternative play, which is a really significant strategic positioning move by the Pentagon that I do not want listeners to miss.
Yeah, Reflection's open weight models are being explicitly contrasted with DeepSeek and Qwen out of China. And the Department of War is signaling that it wants a domestic open source stack for sovereignty reasons.
Which connects back to a story we covered on April 24th about DeepSeek V4, with its 1.6 trillion open weight parameters and the price collapse that rattled frontier AI economics globally.
The Pentagon clearly does not want to be in a position where the only credible open weight AI options are Chinese. So they are deliberately building up Reflection and Nvidia's open offerings as counterweights.
Third implication, and this is the one that keeps me up at night, honestly, is the chilling effect on AI safety advocacy more broadly across the industry as we head into the back half of 2026.
If you are a frontier lab right now and you watched what happened to Anthropic, the lesson is that drawing public lines around weapons use and domestic surveillance can cost you a multi-hundred-million-dollar contract.
That is a powerful incentive to keep your safety commitments quieter, more flexible, and easier to walk back when a major customer pushes hard, which is exactly the opposite of what most policy advocates want.
On the other hand, you could read this as a clarifying moment for the industry, where companies that genuinely care about safety guardrails will distinguish themselves, and the rest will reveal where their priorities really sit.
That's the Anthropic optimistic spin, that being blacklisted is actually a brand-defining moment, like a badge of honor. And it does seem to be playing well with their commercial enterprise customer base based on early signals.
Their commercial revenue numbers continue to climb, and several large enterprises have publicly cited Anthropic's principled stance as a reason to deepen partnerships. So the market is at least somewhat rewarding the position.
My final thought is about the constitutional question lurking underneath all of this. Because Judge Lin's pretextual finding is going to keep working its way through the appellate process over the coming months.
If Anthropic ultimately wins on the First Amendment retaliation claim at the appellate level, that becomes a landmark precedent constraining how the federal government can use procurement power to punish AI companies for their stated values.
And if Anthropic loses, then the precedent runs the other direction, with the executive branch having broad authority to designate any AI company a supply chain risk based on disagreements over usage policy alone.
Either outcome is going to shape AI procurement policy for the next decade, and we will absolutely be tracking it closely on this show as the case continues to wind its way through the courts.
There's also a fascinating dynamic playing out around allied governments, because the United Kingdom, France, and Australia are watching this Anthropic dispute extremely closely as they design their own defense AI procurement frameworks right now.
Several allied capitals have signaled informally that they are actually more sympathetic to the Anthropic position on autonomous weapons, which could create a split where the same model is acceptable in London but blacklisted in Washington.
That kind of jurisdictional fragmentation in defense AI procurement would be an enormous operational headache for any global AI company trying to serve multiple allied militaries with consistent products and consistent terms of use.
And it gets even more complicated when you remember that NATO interoperability standards are supposed to push allied militaries toward common AI tooling, which is hard to achieve when prime contractors have radically different supplier rules.
One last thread I want to pull on before we wrap, which is the role of Congress in all of this, because there are early signals of bipartisan unease about the breadth of the supply chain risk designation.
A Congressional Research Service brief earlier this spring flagged this specific case as raising potential separation of powers questions, and a few senators on the Armed Services Committee have asked publicly for more transparency on the criteria used.
If Congress decides to legislate on what constitutes a legitimate supply chain risk designation versus an act of viewpoint discrimination, that would actually reshape the entire AI procurement landscape, regardless of how the courts ultimately rule.
It would also matter enormously for AI startups, because right now the supply chain risk designation can functionally end your business overnight. And a clearer statutory framework would give companies more predictable rules to plan against.
Massive story, lots of moving pieces, and we have only really scratched the surface of the reflection AI angle, which I think deserves its own dedicated episode in the next week or two.
Agreed. There is so much to unpack on the open weight strategic posture, and we should also keep an eye on whether any of the 7 signed companies starts publicly discussing their own internal usage policies.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.